Okay. So, hello and welcome back, or welcome, thanks for joining us. Today we're talking about LGBTQ plus workplace inclusion, our two-part series this month. And my name is Shauna Kasegi. I use they or she pronouns. I'm the Outreach and Continuing Education Consultant at the Southwest Wisconsin Library System. So please feel free to ask questions in the chat today or use your mic, either one. We welcome your comments and all of your questions on this topic, so please don't hesitate. Last time I wanted to offer myself as a support person on this topic, and I want to repeat that again today, that if you ever find yourself needing a support person in library land on queer things, please reach out to me. I'm happy to help. So with that, I am thrilled to welcome back our guest, Katie Hamm, who is a consultant from Diverse and Resilient, which is a LGBTQ plus public health organization with multiple locations in Wisconsin. And I'm going to pass it on to Katie.
Thank you. Welcome back, everyone who was with us last week. I'm really happy to move the conversation forward today. For folks who weren't here last week, just I guess briefly, maybe a little bit more about who I am and about Diverse and Resilient, who I'm representing today. Diverse and Resilient is a statewide LGBTQ public health organization, and our primary locations are in Milwaukee and in Appleton. We have anti-violence programming, a lot of educational programming. We do HIV prevention, trans advocacy, any of a number of things, youth work, youth support. We're very embedded in the communities that we serve. And back in the day when Diverse and Resilient got their very first funding from the Center for Disease Control to open an HIV testing program, that's when I was hired and worked with the team there as the first straight person they had ever hired for several years, and had a really incredible transformative experience. I was an ally, obviously, going into that role, but really learned how to be an ally in action more than word over the years that I was there. Critical lessons that have served me and will continue to serve me for the rest of my life and my career, most certainly, but really changed me both personally and professionally. And it's in that spirit that I get to do these workshops as an ally, as an advocate for the LGBTQ community, and also as someone who is, I've done a lot of work to be able to be supportive today in the way that I'm supportive, and I'm still learning and I'm still growing and I still make mistakes. And I've learned how to correct those mistakes or how to learn from those mistakes. And so I'm coming to you today not as the be all end all expert doing it perfectly 100% of the time, because I'm not. I have a lot of social conditioning that I still work to unlearn every single day. And so saying that, I think, is important, because I want everyone, to feel safe to ask a question or to express, an experience or share an experience, etc. That just demonstrates that we're all in a different place, and hopefully, however, working toward the same goal, which is really full immersion, inclusion, acceptance, celebration of LGBTQ folks. Sean and I were talking before, when we were logged on early, just to make sure everything was working, and we're just sharing some stories with each other. And one of the things that I can definitely tell you, as someone who's been actively immersing herself in LGBTQ spaces for the last decade plus, that when I'm in a space that is not inclusive or is not affirming of LGBTQ folks, one, it's palpable and tangible. You feel it, you see it, and something is missing. It doesn't feel right to me. It doesn't feel like a space that I want to be in, because the benefit to me personally, even as a heterosexual cisgender person, of having queer folks around me a lot of the time is that my life is better. My life is better. My gender expression has evolved over my, participation with the LGBTQ community. My acceptance of myself, my expression of my sexuality has grown and evolved. And it wouldn't have grown and evolved in those ways if I hadn't been so connected to LGBTQ folks. I think that's important to say to set the tone for what we're working on today, because I invite heterosexual cisgender folks to see how we all benefit by creating more inclusive and affirming spaces for all people. Those of us with majority or dominant identities benefit too, but in ways that maybe have not, been illustrated or shown to us because we've not experienced it. And it's a wonderful journey once you embark on it, I promise you. So, having said that, what we're going to work on today is I mentioned this term minority stress last time, and I want to more explicitly define that because it's an important foundational concept, I think, in understanding why this is so important, why creating very specific inclusive spaces, and by specific, I mean, with policy back that up, why that's so important for LGBTQ folks. We didn't finish all the slides last time, and I have fewer slides this time, but they're super wordy, so we'll see if we get through them today. But I'm bringing the few slides we didn't cover, which were those basic inclusive practices that have nothing to do with policy changes, etc., but that anyone can do and practice, and in doing so, begin to create more inclusive spaces. And so I'm going to bring those basic things back into our conversation today. And then we'll expand on that by looking at very specific workplace best practices that include language for non-discrimination policies, for dress codes. We'll talk about job interviews and job descriptions. We'll talk about transitioning at work and how policies can support that, all those things. And I say this knowing that making big radical changes sometimes in workplaces is very hard and very challenging. And I also know if we don't know what an end goal is or what a best practice is, it's impossible for us to get there. And so we have to know where we are today as compared to where we want to be, and then strategically, methodically, persistently over time, chip away, chip away, chip away until we get there. And so today we're really, I think, setting that goalpost really firmly in the ground for, where we want to be as we move forward. Okay, so let's look at minority stress and minority stress theory. This is a theory by Elon Meyer. And these are the words of the theory. Minority is not my favorite word. I don't think it says what we want it to say or mean it to say as we understand these concepts today. It certainly was at the time that Elon Meyer first researched and developed this theory. So just know that I'm using the word minority, which is not a word that I would choose, but it's the language of the theory. So the theory says this, it's very simple, that prejudice or bias toward minority people is stressful and can lead to adverse mental health outcomes. The theory itself has been studied extensively with LGBTQ people, but it is valid for other systemically oppressed groups also. So when we talk about the stress from oppression around an aspect of what the theory refers to as minority identity, know that we are also talking about what it's like for Black folks in our community. We're also talking about what it's like for Hmong folks in our community, or any other systemically oppressed identity, whether it's through immigration or religion or ability or sexual orientation or gender identity, etc. So the theory says minority stress is socially based. It exists in social systems and structures. It's just there. And an individual has little to no control over the stress that exists in those social systems. And I'll give you some examples of those in a moment. Minority stress is also unique. And what that means is that it's an additive. So it's in addition to what we would consider just general or normative life stressors that exist for all human beings. And it's also chronic. And so it's always there. It's constantly present in cultural structures, in social structures. There's little to no escape from it or respite or peace from it, because you're bombarded in all of your spaces. And so that's by definition what we mean by minority stress. And so I wanted to, this is a super rudimentary slide, but I have never found a better one. I would have to make it, and I just don't have the talent to do that. But I'm using this for a reason, because I want us to understand when we're talking about chronic stress, what we mean, specifically as it relates to, an LGBTQ person, a person of color, a Black, Indigenous, or a person from any other community of color, etc. What it's like for them, right, to receive negative messages about themselves from social structures every day. And so it's helpful then to review what stress looks like, or what stress is. And there's so much wonderful theory as it relates to how stress impacts us both mentally and physically. There's certainly, a number of really wonderful studies about the physical health impact of chronic stress or toxic stress, the mental health impact of toxic stress, but also the behavioral, the psychological, the social impact. So one of the paradoxes of stress is that stress is actually positive. It can be positive, and it's called, in fact, the stress paradox, where we know that a brief, surge of anxiety or stress can actually yield help, a positive outcome to occur. And one of the best examples of that is, taking an exam. I tell this to my students all the time, that if they've studied but they're nervous, it's actually better, because what happens in the body when we're experiencing stress is that there is a release of certainly adrenaline, but also noradrenaline. And these are also called epinephrine or norepinephrine. And that release of norepinephrine in particular, we know what adrenaline does or epinephrine does, right? It increases the heart rate. It increases the contractility of the vessels. It expands the airways. So if you had to put on a quick burst of speed, you could breathe, right? For those of us who are couch potatoes, we're still meant to be able to escape a threat. So there's that going on, but norepinephrine or noradrenaline does something in addition to those things. It supports those physiological responses, but it also improves concentration. It improves focus. And so when we have a moment of stress as it relates to taking an exam, but we've studied for the exam and we got a good amount of sleep the night before, and we had breakfast and we've had a glass of water, so we're good, right? Then that stress actually, because it improves your focus and it improves your concentration, is going to help you perform better on that exam. So that's the stress paradox. Moving on to other categories of stress, this category in the middle of tolerable stress is for more significant, serious life events that can also be traumatic in nature, because it can include a death of someone close to you, the death of a parent or caregiver, the death of a child. It includes divorce or separation, the end of a relationship, changing jobs, moving to another city or community. Those are all incredibly stressful and sometimes traumatic events, but they're in this category of what's called tolerable stress, because the events that fall in that category are considered to be normative, an inescapable part of the human experience. We will all experience those things at some point in our life. And while they are stressful and can be in the moment traumatic, they have a limited duration. That feeling doesn't last forever. And a lot of the study, especially the resiliency studies or the studies on what is called post-traumatic growth, are about tolerable stress events, meaning we grow from those events. We learn things about ourselves that we didn't know before. We develop new skills. We appreciate life in a new way. We find it easier and meaningful, more meaningful to connect with other people. And maybe in particular around, a shared experience, that death in the family, etc. Being able to connect with folks around what grief feels like means that we grow and evolve. And so that's tolerable stress. Toxic stress is different. It breaks us down. It breaks us down. It's ultimately, what we understand when we're looking at, if any of you are familiar with the ACE studies, the studies of adverse childhood experiences of children who have an abusive parent or have, been raised in a home where there was substance abuse, a parent who was incarcerated, intimate partner violence, etc. Those children, depending on how many of those experiences they had, due to their toxic nature and oftentimes chronic nature in the time of childhood, that intimate partner violence maybe that exists in the family between parents is chronic when you're a child. It's ever present in the environment. It's there every day. And so the impact of that is early death. If you have 4 or more of those adverse childhood experiences, it can take up to 20 years off of your life expectancy, according to the studies. And so it's called toxic stress for a reason. What we know about stress and those toxic, stressful events is that racism is a toxic stressor. Transphobia is a toxic stressor. Homophobia is a toxic stressor for folks who are experiencing it every day, right? In multiple spaces in their housing because they have a homophobic neighbor, or they're living with someone who's homophobic or transphobic, finding employment, sustaining employment, or having to hear homophobic jokes in the workplace, which we'll talk about again a little bit today. That those experiences are chronic, can't bring their life partner home for Thanksgiving because, there are homophobic family members that are also invited, and your family isn't creating a safe space for you and your partner. So you have to choose between going home or creating an event with a family of choice. Those experiences are exhausting and physically and mentally debilitating. So when we talk about minority stress, that's what we're talking about. So when we talk about minority stress being socially based, I've kind of given some examples, but very specifically what we mean is that they're messages that we receive from the social systems that we have to interact with every day. We have to go to school as children, right? It's required by law that we receive an education. So we have to be in those spaces, but there can be homophobic and transphobic, and are homophobic and transphobic messages in schools. Sometimes they're from our peers only, but sometimes they're from administrators. Sometimes they're from teachers. Sometimes it's the school board and the community that supports the policies that are harmful, or the teacher keeping their job in spite of homophobic comments. There's a lot of bullying. I think we looked at some of the data from the Wisconsin Youth Risk Behavior Survey last week, and we learned about some of the experiences that LGBT students in our state are having, and they include being electronically bullied. They include being bullied at school, being threatened with a weapon at school, being physically harmed at school, right? So that's an example of a social system. But what we know, because we have to make a living, we have to live and rent an apartment or buy a house because it's a part of the life experience. We go out and go to bars or go to restaurants or go to street festivals in the summertime, and those messages, like the ones that I described happening in schools, are happening in all of those other places. An example, a hard example, but a very real example of this also that I can give you is Many, many, many years ago. This is before working for Diverse and Resilient, as I described, when I was working for United Way. And one of my roles, because I oversaw all of our youth programming, one of my roles with a colleague was to be trained in several evidence-based curricula so that we could be the trainers for uh, programs we wanted to fund in the community. And one of the programs was a teen pregnancy prevention curriculum. My colleague and I facilitated that curriculum in a number of local high schools and middle schools, and we also did some adaptations to the curriculum to make it more LGBTQ inclusive. Even back in those days, we were doing that work. In one particular school, we were facilitating the curriculum in a middle school. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Alliance School here in Milwaukee, but it's an anti-bullying school. It's an alternative school. It's a part of MPS, but it's considered an alternative school. And parents or young people can go to that school, can choose to send a child to that school, or can choose to go to that school if you're someone who has experienced bullying in more traditional schools. And so the Alliance School has a lot of LGBTQ youth, but it also has a lot of youth with disabilities or youth who are just different from other young people in some significant way. And it's a safe learning environment for them. So we're facilitating the curriculum there, and we had a young trans student in our class, and her name was, well, I won't give you her actual name, but we'll call her Lexi for just the story. Lexi was really dynamic. Lexi was 14 years old, very dynamic, very open about being a young trans girl, very open about some of the experiences she had as she was navigating her transness and understanding more and more about her identity and how she wanted to express that every day. And she was one of those students also that had kind of, an orbit around her all the time, because when she was in class, particularly other girls in the class, just wanted to be around her because she was very dynamic. So it was very notable when she wasn't there, and she wasn't there a lot. And over time, as we got to know the students better and as they trusted us more, we learned and heard more and more from Lexi. And one of the things that she shared with us was, for her, getting to school was a safe place. And so she was committed to getting there every day. But the journey for her from her home to school some days was too hard. There was no yellow bus that picked Lexi up, and so she had to take a city bus to school. And the walk from her house to the bus stop, waiting at the bus stop, getting on the bus, arriving at, the bus stop on the other side of, closer to her destination, and then the walk to school sometimes was too hard. And it was too hard because people yelled obscenities at her. She was regularly solicited for sex. There was one morning in particular, and I will never forget it because it was late spring. And you know what late spring is like in Wisconsin, where, we have those puddles near the curb, so near bus stops, of just murky, dark, melted snow, right? Just murky water. It's filled with oil from the street and from cars. It's filthy. It's freezing cold, but it's water. It's a puddle. Lexi was at the bus stop, and a car rolled down its window. The passenger yelled something obscene at her, called her a name. And then the driver rode close to the curb so that they could splash the water, and they yelled obscenities at her, and they drenched her. 14-year-old waiting to go to school. I'm sorry, I'm getting emotional. I get emotional about all of these topics, but this one in particular, because I have a 14-year-old daughter, it really gets me. So they drenched her in freezing water. Lexi chose to get on the bus when it arrived, and she made it to school. And once she made it to school, folks found sweats for her. She could change her clothes. She got dry, all of that. But it was absolutely beyond heartbreaking to hear what Lexi had to go through to get to school. And I'm still furious to this day that we don't have a better system for picking up vulnerable young people with a special route bus or something. We as adults need to figure that out, because Lexi sometimes just couldn't do it. And so that is an example. It's a very strong example, but it is not an unusual example. There are many young trans students who have similar experiences. And that's what we mean when we say that stress, that toxic chronic stress from traumatic events exists in social structures outside of an individual's control. It's in neighborhoods, it's in churches, it's in schools, it's in workplaces, it's in the doctor's office, it's at the bus stop. I don't think I showed this to you. It's complementary to some of what I showed you as it related to workplace experiences of LGBTQ folks, when we met last week. Human Rights Campaign survey. Granted, this is 2014, so a little bit dated, but the things that we had from that Catalyst survey, which I shared with you last time, I may have the slides here as a review, I can't remember, but it's a companion to that. Nothing has radically changed in that time, and we're actually facing some really scary legislation that's moving us backward as it relates to protection of LGBTQ folks, even in the workplace. So at the time of the survey, 35% of LGBT plus people felt compelled to lie about their personal lives at work. And this really means they're not coming out at work. And remember, the data point I think that we had last time was somewhere around 46% of LGBTQ folks in the United States are not out at work. And so this is very similar data. 27% of LGBT folks avoid certain people at work because of unaddressed harassment or homophobia. We're talking today about policies that will specifically address those issues, but 27% is really significant. 30% feel unhappy or depressed at work. 22% seek other employment because they feel unwelcome at their current job. So this is begging us to create policies, but then obviously to uphold those policies, to hold our employees, our workplace communities accountable to those policies. So I didn't include those slides as a review, so hopefully you remember them since it was just last week, but I did add this one. And so this is from a research study that I led as a consultant that we did at Diverse and Resilient. We published it in 2020, but we had the great privilege of working on it for 18 months. So we were funded by DHS to do an assessment of the essentially the capacity building needs of trans folks in our community. And so we worked with 105 trans people over a period of 18 months. We conducted listening sessions. We developed a survey instrument that really looked at categories that fell under those social determinants of health that people have to have in order to lead successful, fulfilling lives. So we conducted the survey, and then we analyzed the results and had focus groups, and we published the results and presented them to DHS. One of the categories was employment. And so some of the questions, we had many, many, many questions, but some of the questions included the ones that you have on the slide. And so one was, how often have any of the following issues caused you stress or anxiety in an employment-based experience? And we meant by that, were you interviewing, were you looking for a job at the time, or were you at work when this occurred? And so 76% of our trans participants said that harassment based on their gender identity occasionally to always caused them stress or anxiety. 66% of our participants occasionally to always were assigned degrading or punitive tasks that their coworkers were not equally assigned. This question came specifically from things that we learned during the listening sessions of folks, people of trans experience saying that, they were asked to do things other people weren't asked to do at work. We had one elder, she was 76 years old, who participated in this process with us, who described being the one who always had to go outside. She worked at a business that was kind of in a strip mall type location. She was the one every day that had to go out and pick up dog poop from the parking lot. No younger person, no one else on staff was ever asked, only this elder Black trans woman. 74% said that there was a lack of safe bathroom accommodations that caused them stress or anxiety every day. One thing I can share with you anecdotally also, because I don't have the specific data point in my head, but I know that young people in school systems who identify somewhere along that trans spectrum, which, remember, includes young people with non-binary identities, young folks who are gender fluid or simply gender non-conforming, right? That trans identity is very vast because it's an umbrella identity. That they have urinary tract infections at higher rates than their peers because they're simply not going to the bathroom at school. They're not drinking water or liquids so that they don't have to pee, and they're not going because it's not always safe for them to do so. Stress regarding how to present your gender. So the folks, talked about how difficult it can be, people again of trans experience, how difficult it can be when looking for work, even to decide, how am I going to present myself at this job interview? Because if I present my gender identity in a way that affirms who I am, I may not get the job and I really need it. But if I don't, and I give that part of myself up in order to interview and potentially get this job, how then am I going to show up at work? And am I going to have to continue to show up in a way that doesn't affirm my identity? That process for folks is incredibly, incredibly stressful. So this data, just that I shared in the last, couple of slides, I'm sharing very specifically because as we now transition into what are some basic best practices and then what are some specific workplace best practices, why are these so important? And this is why this is so important. One of the things we know at Diverse and Resilient is that, and we know this from research, our own research, we know this just from, obviously the years and years and years of reading and learning about the experiences of the LGBTQ community. When folks cannot show up as their whole, full selves, they're not able also to bring their whole full selves to the work. Because if I have to deny an aspect of my identity in order to survive in a workplace, I can't bring my full creativity. I can't bring my innovative ideas. I can't bring all of me. And so we all lose, all of us lose, when folks are not allowed to bring their full selves and have that full self celebrated and protected. And so that's what we're talking about doing today and creating today. Oh, I forgot. I have a couple more slides about minority stress. So that was the social structures piece. So this is the last of that anchoring sort of foundational stuff. Minority stress is also unique and additive. And I love this image because it is such a great illustration of the point, this particular point of the model. Because you see this person bent over from the burden that they're carrying of stress. And so there are all those regular stressors there you see in that boulder on their back that we all experience. And so, those include financial stressors. You see family dynamics, workplace stress, or just work stress when we don't love our job, or even when we do love our job, it can be incredibly stressful. Relationship stressors, an elder or aging parent that we're providing care for, whatever those regular general human experience stressors are, we all have those boulders. We're all carrying those. But what minority stress says, and you can hear from some of the data that I just showed you, is that, LGBTQ folks, BIPOC folks are carrying more boulders. They're carrying more because they're carrying homophobia. They're carrying transphobia. They're carrying racism. They're carrying xenophobia. We're not all carrying all of those boulders, right? Some folks are carrying more. And this is also, behind why we more amazing things coming, in mass coming from our LGBTQ students or LGBTQ colleagues or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, because it's harder for them to get there. That's exhausting. That's exhausting what that person is carrying on their back. And so it's a great anchoring image to carry forward. And then minority stress is chronic. Remember that chronic nature of toxic stress. And these incredible researchers have actually narrowed this down to, and on average, what does this look like for a person as it relates to how many negative messages might one receive in a day? And the theory tells us that it can be, on average, about 15 negative messages. And so if you think about Lexi and that story that I was giving you about her, she received, negative messages from her neighborhood and her environment. She may have received those messages also while on the bus, getting to school. She wasn't necessarily receiving them at school, because of the school she went to, but she was at that school because she did receive those messages at school previously. So you can see how these would add up, right? And so here we have, as an example, Greg. Greg is a 15-year-old gay identified male who receives negative messages about being gay from many sources. And you can wrap your mind around what that would look like for him. Greg receives negative messages about being gay at least 15 times a day. And that those would be in addition to negative messages that Greg receives about being Black. And let's, just name, if this young person is a student in Wisconsin, he's getting a lot of negative messages about being Black. And so that's compounding, right, the stress. Because remember, of course, minority stress is intersectional, and we'll talk about that a couple of different ways today. Greg's been taking in these messages since he was about 4. By age 15, how many doses of anti-gay messages has he received? And so 15 messages a day for a year, so times 365 days, times 11 years is over 60,000 negative messages about one aspect of his identity. This is why understanding the importance of intersectionality is paramount for us, right? We have to understand how different aspects of an individual's identity interact with each other and either serve to lift that person up or serve to hold that person down. And in the example that we just shared of Greg, there are multiple aspects of his identity that are pushing him down because of the stressors that live in those social structures that we were describing. So the last bit on minority stress, and then we will switch gears, is that, minority stress is an external, objective, stressful, situation, condition, because it's out there in the environment and the individual has no control over it. And it isn't necessarily personal to that individual if it's simply an anti-gay message. It is personal because it impacts that individual, but it's not, hey, you Greg, right? And calling Greg the F word. It can simply be a homophobic remark that someone made in his presence that impacted him. So that's what the objective means there. The expectation of stressful events and the vigilance that the expectation requires is stressful. What we know about this is that those harmful events don't also have to have happened to an individual personally in order for them to be impacted by it personally. Because if I know, because I saw it yesterday, that someone who shares my identity was bullied at school, then I know that even though it didn't happen to me yesterday, it could happen to me today. And I am hypervigilant, right? All the time looking, protecting myself, trying to make sure that it's not coming at me. And that's incredibly stressful. We internalize negative societal attitudes. This is important. If you hear negative messages about yourself every day over time, even if intellectually you know those messages are not true, you still internalize them. And we have to do a lot of work every day to say, nope, that's a lie. Nope, that's a lie. Just think about messages that you might have received about your weight. Think about messages you might have received about your appearance in some other way. Think about messages you might have received at some point in your life about your ability to do something. If you heard those negative messages enough, you've been impacted by them And you may have that voice in your head that tells you that those messages are true. And you have to work really hard every day to say, nope, 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 and rewire your brain, right? That's incredibly exhausting when we do that every day, or have to do that every day. And so stress for LGBTQ people increases according to the research, and over time contributes to negative health outcomes. This is the impact of the stress, the impact of what we call avoidant coping mechanisms. We looked at some health outcomes last time. Remember smoking at higher rate, LGBTQ folks smoking at higher rates than the general population because smoking is a coping mechanism. And there are higher rates of avoidant coping resources in communities that are more oppressed. And so that's important. Okay, let's shift. So that's all the right? All the why are we here? And this now is shifting us into, okay, what can we do? Concrete, what can we do? So these are basic general practices, right, that anyone can do. The first is in any environment that you curate, and I really love to think about us curating environments because we're constantly looking and moving things. That table would be better over there. Oh, I like that picture framed actually next to the window instead of over there by the bathroom. Or just, our spaces evolve as we evolve. So one of the things that we can be very, very intentional about is having affirming images and messages about healthy, thriving LGBTQ people. It is so important that we all get surrounded by those images and those messages of families, same gender, same sex families raising their children, right? And leading in that way because they're doing the work of building a healthy, strong family. We need to see those images. We need to see images of open LGBTQ teachers and leaders and mentors, community members, right? Or we need messages that just say, like this one, this is a positive space. Everyone is affirmed and welcomed, and we will defend you and protect you in this space. Those signs are important. So when we use those visual tools, when we have those present intentionally in a space, then we have to live up to them, right? We can't just have a rainbow sticker on a window and then you walk in and I fill out this application for a job and there's no place for me to put my pronouns. So we're going to do that, and we need to do that. We have to do the other things too, or we have to be working really hard to advance those things. Some other general things that can be affirming are we need to just in general suspend the process, stop allowing our brain to make assumptions about someone's sexual orientation or gender identity just by looking at them. Trust me, you don't know. You don't. People will surprise you every day, and thank goodness. Thank goodness. I don't want to be surrounded by people who are exactly like me in every way, because then I wouldn't grow. I wouldn't evolve. I wouldn't be able to learn more every day about how to show up as my fullest self, right? So just don't let people surprise you. Don't make assumptions based on sexual orientation or gender identity, right? Don't make assumptions about who someone should be in relationship with, or what their life should look like, or what they should sound like, or how they should dress, or what their sexual behavior may be like. Don't make those assumptions once you know their sexual orientation or gender identity, because you don't know those things. You don't know those things. And this is especially important because it goes with, remember when we talked about heterosexual privilege in particular, and we talked about, folks who are straight don't ever have to worry about, people's other parents in the community not wanting their children to come over and play with your kid at your house because they're worried about the the depravity that may be lurking, in our basement, or that I may somehow, if I were gay, want to convert their child to my sexual orientation. I mean, there are wild things that people think, right? So that's, again, something that you have to caution yourself from doing, not allow yourself to do. If someone comes out to you, know that there is an emotional cost to coming out that is weighed every single time someone does it. And they have to decide if it's worth the risk or not. So if someone comes out to you, and it means that they weighed the cost, and what they could potentially gain by coming out to you was greater, right? And they decided to take the risk. And don't judge folks who haven't come out to you. If you're the last person in your network or the last person in your family to know that someone is gay or lesbian or bi or gender fluid or whatever, if you're the last person to hear that, don't be offended by that either, because that could simply mean that they weren't ready to take that risk with you yet. And so that's never a personal, dig against you as a human being. And so please don't take it as such or get defensive at that point. Simply, if and when someone comes out to you, show appreciation for the trust that they showed in you and say, thank you. Thank you for telling me that. I love knowing that about you. Ah, I appreciate it, right? Do that. And then avoid asking invasive questions. Allow someone to tell you what they want to tell you when they're ready to tell you. If someone comes out to you, it isn't your moment to say, oh my God, I've been dying to ask. Who's the man or who's the woman in the relationship? Or are you thinking about having surgery? Are you taking hormones? Are you, fill in the blank? That's absolutely none of your business. None of your business. Even knowing someone's pronouns, if they share their pronouns with you, particularly in a professional setting, doesn't mean that you then have the right to ask their gender identity. They may not want to share that with you, and it isn't really anything that concerns you in any way. They just shared their pronouns so that you can use the appropriate pronouns for them. So those are some basic things we can all do. I shared this or version of this in an email as a follow-up to our session last week, but I wanted to provide it again here. So language matters, right? And it is a form of best practice. And so our intake forms, our applications, anything that someone fills out in our, workplace can include this best practice as it relates to collecting gender identity, right? And so this, again, I'm offering to you as a goal, and know that the terms on here can change. The words evolve. Sean and I were just talking briefly again before the workshop started about how we learn something new all the time, and how we used to discuss these concepts a few years ago is not how we discuss them today, because we continue to grow and learn. And so don't treat this as a static document, but as something that, should continue to grow and evolve. But again, that best practice for collecting gender identity is a two-part question: sex at birth, current gender identity. And you see, we have male, female, intersex, and we also have decline to answer. If they don't want to answer, they don't have to. Current gender identity, and you have a number of options. And you'll see here, we talked about the difference between sex assignment terms and gender terms, and male, female really are sex assignment terms, but you see, even we have them here under gender identity because they're still mostly used as gender identity in the general public. And so we didn't use man, woman here, but used male, female. But that is a choice that we made that we could easily have done differently, and it would have been fine. You'll see discovering, which we talked about, again, decline to answer. But then I wanted to just touch on using prefer to self-describe instead of other. Other is a terrible remnant of the past, and we should just lose it altogether. We should lose it as it relates certainly to gender identity, but we should lose it as it relates to race, as it relates to ethnicity. No one is other. What are we even saying when we do that, right? ick, yuck. That's what we're saying. So when we, instead of other, use prefer to self-describe, we're simply allowing someone to say, I don't really see myself here, or I do, but I would like to tell you more. And that person can fill in what they feel is important for you to know about them. And that's so much more affirming than other, right? Which communicates something that today we do not want to be communicating to our colleagues, to our program participants, to our community.
Hey, Katie, we
So
have a question
yeah,
whenever you're ready.
no, go ahead.
Someone asks, I have an employee who has worked for me for years. She was hired as Susan. Now she has decided she wants to be called Ronan. How do I approach this? Her name has not been legally changed, but if someone calls her by her real name, she comes back short with them and says she wants to be called Ronan. She has gotten upset with me when I call her by her real name, but that is who I know her by. Um, just asking how the best way to approach this situation.
Yeah, we're actually going to talk a little bit about that in the workplace best practices. And so I'll maybe we can have a bigger conversation in a few moments. But I would offer just quickly, before we get there, a quick response. I would say a couple of things. I would say that, and I'm hearing a name that is not traditionally accepted as a woman's name, which is Ronan. Could go either way, though. It could be someone who identifies as non-binary choosing that name. Could be that this individual is discovering a gender identity that maybe is male, or any of a number of other, certainly, identities that fall under that trans umbrella, or not. I don't have enough information. But I would say that if Ronan is the name that they're giving you right now, then that's their real name. What we say about the other name is that that was the name they were assigned at birth. That's their government name. You hear a lot of trans folks, saying that's my government name, because that's the name that was on the birth record. And that's the name on perhaps a driver's license, IDs, Social Security, etc., because it's very time consuming and it can be very expensive to change your name. Diverse and Resilient does have a program, though, that's free to the public for changing your government IDs. And so I throw that out there in case anyone needs access to that. But I would say the real name is Ronan. And as if you're the boss or the supervisor, it is your responsibility to model that for other people. And there should be consequences for folks for not using the name that affirms this employee's gender identity. Even if it's a challenge for folks, even if it's hard, that's not an excuse to not do it. And I acknowledge it does require effort and work. When we put in the work, when we make the effort, we're communicating to Ronan that they matter, that their comfort and their well-being matters to us. Candy, did you have something else to offer? I see I just got the pop-up that you raised your hand.
Throw this in. It's not any harder than remembering to call someone by their newly married last name.
You're absolutely right. And there are so many examples of that. You're absolutely right. And what do we do if someone gets married and changes their last name? When we make the mistake, what do we do? So easily, without even thinking, we go, oh, sorry, and we correct ourselves and we move on, because that's what we do. We have to do that with folks who are in any stage of transition and who are asking us to use a different name than the one that we're accustomed to using, because it isn't about us. Our convenience is not what is at stake here, right? It's someone else's health and well-being. And so we'll talk about that more extensively in just a little bit, because I have slides specific to transitioning at work that I think might be helpful, or at least give you a little bit more to think about. So yeah.
Thanks.
Oh, you said thanks. Is that what you said, Shauna?
Sorry.
Okay. No, I was talking at the same time. I wanted to make sure I wasn't talking over another question. We will definitely talk more about that particular topic in a moment. So again, on this concept or this topic though of language mattering, one of the easy things that we can do is to simply stop saying, husband or wife. Stop saying boyfriend or girlfriend. Simple things like that. We can ask instead, who are important people in your life? Do you have a significant other? Are you in a relationship? Do you live with anyone? Or simply tell me about yourself. Using the term partner or spouse, life partner, instead of husband or wife, instead of girlfriend or boyfriend. When you're getting to know someone, especially, opens up the possibility that they can share more of who they are with you, because you're intentionally not using, more outdated terms that have a gender ascribed to them, right? When we eliminate that, we open it up to whoever they're seeing and whoever is in their life and whoever they are. Bathrooms, folks, bathrooms, we're not going to get away from this. And I know that because of, just the current landscape of our country, this is a challenging, and again, a challenging topic. And I just wish that it weren't. I wish it weren't, because it's really just about using a bathroom. It's really just about relieving ourselves, performing a basic bodily function that we all have to perform, and we need a safe place to be able to do it. And so having an affirming environment always includes a gender neutral or a gender affirming bathroom. And this is for your staff, but this is also for your patrons. It's for community members who use the facility. It's for vendors. It's for groups that come in and, have a meeting or an event in your space, whatever. It's for everyone. And it communicates that you see everyone. It communicates that you recognize that not everyone is safe in a traditional bathroom. And there are a number of signs. I mean, these are just a couple of silly ones pulled from the internet, but you don't have to have, an image of a person on there at all. You can simply have, gender neutral bathroom. The sign also, if you go back to that first thing we were talking about of having visual tools and visual clues in your environment that you're affirming, having a sign that says gender neutral bathroom this way is another one of those visual signs, visual clues that you are affirming, that you're in an inclusive space. I wish we had time. We don't, because I want to get to more of these policy language slides. But so much harm comes to trans people in bathrooms. And I showed you a couple of the data points regarding, the stress and anxiety that even adults experience around where they can go safely use the restroom, that it's just past time for us to get this together. And let me also just offer lastly, before I move on, the gender affirming, the gender neutral bathroom cannot be in the basement down 2 flights of stairs or up on the 7th floor, but you have to stop on the 3rd floor and get the key from Frank. Frank will go up with you to the 7th floor, to the bathroom, unlock it, and then wait outside to lock the bathroom when you're done. Like, no, because that's not an accessible bathroom. It doesn't matter that it exists. It needs to be just as accessible as all of the other bathrooms in the facility. So as a part of affirming practice, we do all have to identify colleagues. If we're talking specifically about a workplace, colleagues that are doing this work too, colleagues that we can go to help hold us accountable, to problem solve with, etc. And those people we go to, unless they've offered themselves, as Shauna has done, do not need to be LGBTQ folks, because that LGBTQ person's job is not to educate you unless they have said that they're willing to do that. I'm going to talk about ERGs in just a moment. I do want to say, as part of this also, and I kind of, illustrated it a moment ago when Candy offered that, we do this all the time when folks get married and change their name, and we have to correct ourselves sometimes and get it right, practice, and move on. In that, illustration I offered, when we make a mistake, we say sorry and we just keep going. That's important when we make a mistake with LGBTQ folks, with a name, with a pronoun, with whatever that is, because if you're learning a new behavior, you're going to make mistakes, and you need to just accept that it will happen. But we apologize. And when we apologize, we just say, sorry, I'm working on that. And you keep going. You keep going. What we don't do is go, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I feel terrible, and go on and on and on, because then what we do is make that other person, A, very uncomfortable, and B, put pressure on them to make us feel better in that moment. And we cannot do that. We have to say, oh man, sorry, move on. Move on, just simply as you would if, Mary Smith is now Mary Jones, and you said, oh, I want to introduce my colleague Mary Smith. Oh, rats, Mary Jones. Same energy, bring that same energy. And so going back for a moment to that, it's not an LGBTQ person's job. Did I leave it in here? Oh, I didn't. I had, I think, maybe it's in here later, something that I pulled from social media last year. I'll save my comment for that slide if it's still in here. So let's jump in. Let's talk about some workplace best practices and simply things for you to consider. And let's remind ourselves this moment that we're staking in the goalpost, right? And then we're walking back to where we are now. And so now we know how far we have to kick the ball. Sports analogy coming to mind for some reason. We know how far we have to kick the ball. We have to know where we are. We have to know where we want to go, right? To start methodically getting there. So I know that what I'm offering today for the rest of our time together may not be at all representative of where you are, but even in the question that we had already about someone transitioning and using a different name now at work, and all of those things means that the things that these policies protect are already happening in your workplaces. So let's go. Interviews and job descriptions. I mentioned in the previous slide that particularly folks who are trans, and this doesn't mean that other LGBTQ community members don't also experience this, but the data that I brought you is specific to the trans community. There is stress just about how will I show up for a job interview. So let's start there. Where do you post your jobs, right? Where are they advertised? How are they written? It's so common. And I hear this, in anti-racist spaces also. So we're creating a culture of, of inclusion for LGBTQ folks. When we're doing work around including people of color, one of the things that we talk about is, or hear a lot is, but we advertise our jobs and quote unquote, they just don't apply. They don't come. Okay, let's rewind that a little bit and say, how's the job posting or job announcement written? And where are you posting it? Are you posting it in spaces that will draw more diverse, a group of diverse applicants, right? Are you going to LGBTQ centers? Are you, advertising in places where LGBTQ folks hang out, or members of the Black community, or members of the Hmong community, or Native and Indigenous folks? Are you posting in, Black churches? Are you posting in all of these places where folks live who you say you want to recruit to these positions? Because if you're not doing that, you're not changing anything or doing anything differently, but you're expecting a different, or hoping for a different miraculous outcome. That outcome won't happen if you don't change what you're doing. So specifically now for LGBTQ folks, is there any gendered language at all in your job announcement? We talked about the reach and where to post, but we really want to look also at the language of the job announcement. When you're in the process of hiring folks, right? If you have an applicant, I'll talk about dress codes in just a moment. When you have an applicant that's dressed perhaps in a way that you wouldn't consider gender appropriate because maybe it doesn't conform to gender norms, and they show up that way for the interview, are you uncomfortable? And is that someone you would remove from the candidate pool simply on the basis of that? Maybe you think it through and think they're qualified, but it would be too much work to bring them on because I'd have to educate patrons. I'd have to educate colleagues and coworkers, and I don't have the skill to do that. I can't hire this person. I don't have time for this. Have you ever, or would you have a thought process that's something like that. On the phone, right? On the phone, I think of the example we were just given, and I don't remember the government name, Sheila or Susan or something like that. But, and for trans folks, eventually that becomes a dead name also. Let me just name that at a certain point, a trans individual does not want to hear what is called their dead name, because that is no longer who they are. And so if I have, as part of an application, a government name and or a name on an application that I call someone, right, for a phone interview and expect to hear a particular gendered voice and I don't, does that put me off? Do I again feel uncomfortable and not move that person forward because the tone of their voice didn't match the assumption I had based on the name? These are all things, this is all work we have to do in order to create the spaces we're trying to create. So things for you to think about. How does your dress code impact how you see people during interviews? Do you have a gendered dress code? We're going to talk about that very specifically in a moment, but do you have also, beyond the company dress code, do you have notions in your mind about how we're supposed to show up? What a particular gender is supposed to dress like or look like? And again, when you see someone who doesn't conform to what you consider to be a norm, does it make you uncomfortable? Because that's a wonderful opportunity for you to do some self-exploration so that you can unpack that. I promise you that we're talking about the impact that has on the LGBTQ community. Those norms, that conditioned thinking is impacting you too in ways that you perhaps haven't yet explored. We have to have solid non-discrimination policies. A good non-discrimination policy includes clear language, obviously, that discrimination will not be tolerated. And we have to make sure when we talk about who is protected in this policy that we're including gender identity and sexual orientation, but also gender expression. Gender expression, how someone shows up, how someone dresses, right, also has to be protected. We need to get specific about prohibited behavior, words you may not say, things you may not do. And I would include in that, you must use someone's correct pronouns. You must use the name someone is asking you to use for them, because that is their name. We can change our name 20 times over the course of our life, an infinite number of times. It's a primary way that young people explore their identity in adolescence, by changing their name, changing their pronouns, and we just flow with that and go with that as they're in that process of discovery, because that's the way we can be supportive of them. And so we want to make sure that those specific examples are included in that prohibited behavior. And then a description of what can occur if you violate the behavior. And when we're talking about violating the behavior, the prohibited behavior, I'm not talking about, now we have, Ronan and someone accidentally used the wrong name and corrected themselves and said, oh, I'm sorry, Ronan, and moved on, right? That's trying to get it right. That's someone who is well-intentioned and is practicing doing it right. We're talking, however, about consequences for folks who simply refuse to say Ronan, or simply refuse to use different pronouns. When that happens, that needs to have a consequence associated with it. So there also needs to be a clear outline for grievance for someone who has experienced discrimination. If someone comes to us and says, this keeps happening, please do something about it, we have to have a procedure that includes prompt investigation of the complaints, and of course protection, as any good non-discrimination policy should already include protection against retaliation. But we have to take this very seriously, and it should be transparent, right? It should be a transparent process. Someone files a grievance, we promptly investigate, and we should say within how many days the investigation will occur. We should include how we communicate the findings of that investigation. We should include what consequences would be included if a violation is in fact identified. identified and confirmed. This reminder that discrimination and harassment are intersectional. Something that we have to recognize certainly is that oppression takes many, many forms, and how individuals are impacted based on their whole self is critical. So if we think about that young Greg who would have been receiving those negative messages about his sexual orientation, in addition to messages about his race, it means that those microaggressions, those stressful events, that harassment that he is or may be experiencing, we have to take even more seriously because the burden he's carrying is already so great. Okay, so I hope that point is clear. Some language around this also, and I apologize for really wordy slides. There's so much good language around this, and in a way, I mean, I hate, obviously like wordy slides in general, and I'm really guilty of doing them. I share the PowerPoint with you after, and I want you to have the full language. So it's also important as a part of recognizing how we implement these things, keeping intersections of identities in mind, is that within this movement to full inclusion, there are so many voices and so many different experiences, and we have to listen to each of those unique voices. We have to also be mindful that one person does not speak on behalf of an entire community, but they are sharing their personal experience, and we should be informed by that experience. And so when we're doing what we're doing, when we're listening to people's experiences and we're making changes based on those experiences, we're lifting their voices. And that's critically, critically important. And then also recognize that I am going to read this last bullet point because I think it's so important. Valuing that voice and lifting up that voice means promoting, supporting the leadership and the storytelling of those most affected by these policies and practices that we're talking about, right? And those stories are sometimes the emotional anchor that actually move people into action. And so creating space for those stories to be shared is really important. If you see or hear something, say something. That should be a best practice. That is a part of the culture of your workplace. We don't put the burden on LGBTQ folks to be the only ones saying something. If you see someone doing something harmful to a colleague who's an LGBTQ person, then you be the one to say something. You say, I observed this, and somebody needs to pull this person aside and have a conversation with them because it isn't okay. We also have to be open to critical feedback ourselves. Part of this change, and I am going to give you more policy language here in a moment, but part of this, and we're going to be running very close on time, is creating this culture of growth where we accept critical feedback, we welcome it, we can't grow without it. We willingly have hard conversations. I can't speak obviously for any of you. I absolutely hate confrontation. I hate having hard conversations with people who I feel maybe won't be accepting of the conversation, whatever. I hate it. And I hate more going to bed with myself at the end of the day if I didn't do it. I can't stand it. I can't live with myself. And so I will have the hard conversation every time. I'll do it every time. I'll be the one. If you want somebody to say something about something, I'll be the one. I will do it. As much as I hate it, as much as it makes me feel sick to my stomach, as much as, I need 2 weeks to recover from it afterward, but I will do it every time, because it's that important. Here is that little snippet really coming from this concept of LGBTQ folks are not here to educate us. It's not their job to educate us. It's not their job to carry the banner on these things by themselves. And so this was a post on social media that I thought was just so well articulated and made this point so well. And so this person writes, told one of my friends that I unfriended my homophobic, transphobic uncle on Facebook before coming out. And they responded with, but how can you open his mind that way? So this person says, just a reminder to everyone, my job as a member of the LGBTQ community is to exist. My job is to be happy. My job is not to educate. I'm willing to help you educate yourself, but above all else, it is my job to find peace that I've wanted for years. If someone does not make me feel good, why should I have to be a part of their life? I do not have to suffer so that others can grow. A blooming garden is not expected to keep its vines and weeds, so why should I? I couldn't say that better. Okay, so I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit so that we can get to the end. So again, this notion of language, really comb through your policies for gender neutral language. Use they instead of he, she. It's accepted practice. It's been accepted practice. And we just have to do it. And so when we do that, obviously the impact is great because people are represented who don't identify with the gender binary, right? And people who do identify somewhere on a gender binary also see themselves because they is neutral. So that's just a basic thing. And again, just reiterating the importance of they, them, which we've talked about. And on this slide actually is an illustration of how we use they, them already. And it's really not a big deal. Transitioning at work. I told you we would have a couple slides on this. So just know that, oh my goodness, I'm so grateful that you shared the story of Ronan because what Ronan is going through, not just at work likely, but in all of their spaces is hard. And they need our support. They're going to face discrimination, isolation. They may lose family members, friends, access to nieces and nephews and grandchildren, or whatever, because that's what happens when folks transition, especially later in life. And so critical to create a space where that's not occurring or where there are very specific consequences for harming Ronan. So gender transition, so let's just talk in general terms about what that means, because it means something different to anyone who is experiencing it. There is no singular way to transition, right? And so for some people, it might include just changing their name and their pronouns and maybe how they dress. But for other people, it may include surgery. It may include use of hormones, but it's a very personal process. It's defined by the individual who's experiencing it. And so the guidelines and any formal documents that we create around protecting people during transition at work need to be general enough to simply name that it's a personal process, and however someone chooses to transition, they will be supported here. So providing specific guidelines for that is helpful both to the person who's transitioning and to the team, right? To supervisors and administrators and team members, because it governs how we behave around that transition. So some of the guidelines, and I have a link here that can give you more on this, so please definitely look this up, but the guidelines should at bare minimum include expectations as to what kinds of support transitioning employees will receive from management, expectations of management and other staff in facilitating the transition. And that's going to include, for example, how do we communicate this? How would, I'm going to, I hope it's okay that I continue to use the example that you gave us. But for example, I would suggest asking Ronan what kind of communication they would like. Would they like to make to announce it in an email with some guidelines for how to talk about Ronan and how to talk to Ronan going forward? Would they instead prefer for you to do that, to have some kind of communication about the transition? That language should be vetted with Ronan first, if that's what Ronan says that they would like for you to do, to make sure that what you share is okay with Ronan. And Ronan may not want anyone to make a big deal about this at all, but we should let Ronan decide how they want this to be communicated to folks and when. We should have related policies and practices for assisting with transition. So bathroom accommodations. Where does someone now need to use the restroom if we don't have a gender neutral bathroom? And is this the time then to create one, a gender neutral restroom in the facility? What happens as it relates to healthcare, right? And what healthcare packages and coverage your insurance provider offers, and is there trans inclusive care? And if there isn't, you have a responsibility, to your HR team to find additional providers that do have inclusive care for employees who need that. Look at your dress code again, making sure that it's not gendered. We'll talk about dress code specifically in a second, but that it allows for the full breadth of someone who's transitioning to explore their gender expression and to have that be protected from harassment. Confidentiality and privacy. This person's transition is happening in a public place because it's a public library, it's a workplace, but they also have the right to privacy around that too. And so including them in the communication and the support design for their unique situation is really, really critically important. We can't do it without their input and their insight. Dress codes. So we've talked a lot about them. Let's look at them specifically. First and foremost, employers have the right to have a dress code. We have the right to say, this is what a professional attire is like in our industry or in our field. But it shouldn't at the same time ascribe to gender norms or reinforce traditional gender norms. Folks, we're evolving away from that, and we just have to get on board with it. So the dress code policy shouldn't be gendered at all. So if we decide, what is acceptable as it relates to jewelry, as it relates to skirt length, as it relates to heels or types of shoes or makeup or hair dye or body art or whatever your policy is for, that is just for any body, right? Any human body who decides to wear a skirt has to wear a skirt that's at least this length. Any human body that wants to wear heels needs to make sure that they have a strap in the back because, it's a tripping hazard otherwise or whatever. But you get the point that I'm making. It shouldn't reinforce traditional gender norms. And then again, we have to protect how someone shows up to work. As long as it aligns with the dress code for the human body, they should be protected from harassment if it doesn't conform to gender norms. I have this in here. I'm actually going to skip it. You can go back to it and read it when I send it. It's just about our ability when we're gathering research sometimes to look for things that are disaggregated, and that's incredibly important. I'll let you read more about that. Let's talk about employee resource groups in workplaces. They're incredibly important. So employee resource groups, or ERGs, provide safe spaces for folks to get together, to talk about their experiences in the workplace, to just be in community with one another. When we talk about specific ERGs for LGBTQ people, they should include allies. They should include allies always, because someone may not be out at work, may want to join the ERG, but if it's not open to allies, they then, in order to join, would be outing themselves, perhaps before they're ready. So it has to include allies. And then allies join, right? Because in that safe space, we learn how to be better allies. There are opportunities to process policies, to process experiences. And then sometimes as an ally, then it's my job to take that to administration, because less harm comes to me in doing that. And maybe that's the ask of the ERG, of the allies, that in those moments when it's time to advance something, that we step up and that we carry that banner that I was describing before. Other things can come out of those ERGs. Insight into, we talked about where to post job announcements, insight into where LGBTQ folks hang out in your community. So, who the good healthcare providers are, where the great bars and restaurants are that are inclusive, because then those are places you want to be as an organization. Those are potentially other organizations that you can partner with, right? For events, for announcements, whatever, but develop relationships with to continue to push you to grow in these areas. So as we're doing these things, know there is no one size fits all. And so know that you're creating a policy that can be general enough to scoop up everyone, and know that there are individuals within it that are going to need more protection. So for example, the challenges a trans person may face in the workplace are different to those of a cis gay man. They're just incredibly starkly different. And we have to acknowledge that they are different and be intentional in our policies, our protective policies around the most vulnerable of our community members. You need to also look at things like merit-based promotions, right? Review policies about that. And this point is important because historically look at who's been promoted and who's been hired, but also look at whether or not you're leaving people out based on how folks get promoted within your organization. Because this last point here, some employees will be at a different stage in their development as a result of inequality and discrimination. They won't have had the same opportunities that other people have had because of that stress in the environment. That sometimes, think of Lexi not graduating on time because she couldn't get to school. That's not because of Lexi, that's because of discrimination and an oppressive environment. And so how do we promote Lexi at the same rate that we're promoting other people? How do we graduate Lexi on time? How do we provide those services so that Lexi has the same experience as everyone else? At the heart of all of this is authentic relationship. We certainly want to focus and necessarily HR policies focus on what we don't want and consequences for harassment and discrimination and things like that, because we have to get specific around that language. But what we want is an inclusive environment, right? An inclusive environment that fosters the growth and the development of affirming authentic relationships. We want a culture in our workplace where people want to be, people want to work there, people show up there because it's safe, it's affirming, and they're able to bring more of their whole selves to work. And that is infectious and that's contagious. It's like, remember I told you other girls in the class just wanted to be around Lexi, because when Lexi showed up big, and she was contagious and infectious. And I want that. I want that in all of my spaces. And I want that for you. I want that for my LGBTQ siblings and cousins. And I want that for heterosexual cisgender folks, because it is better. It's better. And real change happens through those authentic, affirming relationships, because then for the heterosexual cisgender folks listening today, it becomes personal. It becomes personal. I'm not going to allow someone to talk to you that way. I'm not going to allow discrimination to happen because I want to protect, because I love you and I'm going to protect you. And I'll stand up for you because of my care and regard for you, I feel responsible in that way for stepping into a space to protect when I need to do that, to speak out when I need to do that. We do that from heart space, not from head space, when we're in authentic relationship with each other. Oh my goodness, we did it with 2 minutes to spare. I was afraid I wasn't going to make it. So let me bounce out of the share. I know we just have 2 minutes, but is there anything more I can address? Anything more on that original question that we had? And thank you for offering that. And also know, from me, please hear from me, that if that's the first time you're experiencing something like that, you're not going to know how to handle it. And so I wouldn't expect you to. It's wonderful that you're here today, and it's wonderful that you're getting to hear some of the best practices that you can move forward and create a more supportive environment for Ronan and for anyone else that's out there listening that has a similar situation, or if it's you and now you know what to ask for,
We
So
had a
any
great,
questions
we had a great comment,
for,
a great comment earlier. Do we as employers need to know someone's assigned sex at birth? Isn't the second question, their gender identity and their pronouns, more important and relevant to interacting in the workplace?
Yes, 100%. You don't. I think, at Diverse and Resilient, because we work with a lot of healthcare systems and we work with health advocacy a lot, and someone's sex assignment at birth then is relevant in that context. If that isn't relevant, just have gender identity, but include more, right, than man, woman, or male, female. Include more. And then, yes, that's all you need to know. 100% correct. We don't need to know. Assign sex at birth. And I am so glad that you said that.
Thank you so much, Katie. I know this is a lot of information, and I just really appreciate your time. Someone says excellent information and examples, very relevant and helpful in the library and life. Thank you.
I'll read the chat when we end, and if you'll hold the meeting open for just a moment, Shauna, I'll read to see if there's anything there that I need to see, and I do like to see what folks are experiencing. But thank you. You thanked me, but I thank you. I think the world of librarians, and I cannot tell you how many times over the course of my career, I mentioned, I think in the first workshop, my background is really with runaway and homeless youth and also HIV prevention, a lot of work with the trans community. And I cannot tell you how many times the safe spaces that we tell folks to go sometimes when they don't have a safe space is the library. And that's pretty incredible to me. So we've been partners in crime, we've been accomplices all these years anyway. And so how lovely to do this work with you the last couple of weeks.
Thank you so much, Katie.